later. This is our first, I guess, informal episode of this theme, and I anticipate the episodes to last a little less than an hour, maybe even less than that. But in particular, I want to take the time in each one of them to kind of give a quick overview of a certain facet, pardon the pun, of the world of the prism, and give all of you an opportunity to perhaps ask a few questions, get some information that you can't find in any of the current adventure streams, or to amplify your understanding even if you do get some of it from the streams. I am looking at things and seeing whether we are operating. It still looks like we are. I'm always paranoid when I first start these things. All right, so Nycos, the game world's cosmology, is kind of fascinating in terms of when it all started. Many of you who have never played role-play games probably have no idea what I'm talking about when I speak of cosmology, but I'm referring to the origins of how I came to the game world I have. I'm still trying to see whether we are. Let me see here. Ah, there we go. All right. So, yeah, don't have anybody watching yet, but that's okay. Even if nobody watches this, at least I caught it for posterity so I can build notes for it for later. For a retry somewhere down the road. At any rate, the origins of Nycos, you have to realize, occurred when I was, or started when I was 11 years old. I just learned to play the game and was absolutely fascinated, but I knew there were people who, even from that age, I knew there were people that were older than me that were more sophisticated than I. Okay. Thanks a lot, Trav. It didn't show as any viewers, so you must be watching it on YouTube. Excellent. So, the concept of Nycos, the very idea of creating my own game world, actually happened pretty quickly, because when I first started, it literally was dungeon crawl after dungeon crawl after dungeon crawl. And you may or may not know the origins of Dungeons & Dragons itself, but it spawned out of a miniatures game called Chainmail, where units of martial forces in varying stages of armament and weaponry would engage each other on fields of battle, and as units would be eliminated, they would be removed from the board. But the rules didn't specify that they were killed, because all they referred to was being demoralized or unable to continue fighting, or no longer a valid fighting force. And so the designers questioned right off the bat whether or not the actual soldiers themselves, if they had to leave the battlefield, how would they make it home? And having those kind of questions, of course, in a world where Homer records for us the Odyssey that describes exactly such an engagement, led to the natural thought process of, well, what if they went through fantasy realms and had to deal with the different creatures and entities and such like, and so therefore they would build their story to explain how those soldiers got from point A to point B. And D&D became the brainchild of that process. At any rate, when I started playing, that history was not even known to me. Like I said, I had simply played the game with my buddy's Grandpa Dave and was fascinated with it, and started creating my own creature list and monster list, and developing my own bell curve structures to determine success fail on dice rolls to approximate the same effectiveness as the percentile dice and the polyhedrals that weren't yet available to me. So along comes yet another of the many moves that I had in my life. I went to 22 different grade schools and 6 different high schools, so I got around a bit. Anyway, in that process of going from point A to point B, I ran into groups that were far more sophisticated, 15 and 16-year-old kids that were playing, that had already gotten their hands on the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Player's Handbook, for example, or the Monster Manual, which was, of course, the third of the three to actually be released. But when dealing with the concept of creating a world, I had linked my stories together in the first, what I call the first iteration. It was in a single valley, and it was basically a network of underground adventure after underground adventure that linked to create a larger overall story. And when these players, who I idolized because they were so much older and so much more sophisticated, which is really funny because I was just younger than they were. That really wasn't an issue of sophistication, but nonetheless, one of them was a particularly eloquent storyteller, and I asked him specifically about one of the story elements in his game was that there was this errant moon, this randomly appearing satellite of his world, and he didn't use it every week. It wasn't set up as a part of his storyline or mythos. It just simply was a reality that this extra moon would fly by periodically. And so in story, I asked for my character, who is at the time was let's just say he was named after arguably the second most famous halfling in the world, that is a Baggins, because Frodo outdoes Bilbo in a recognition study, I suppose. Anyway, my character's name was Bilbo Baggins. And so in story, I talked with that storyteller about the possibility of actually accessing that real estate, to actually put my claws, so to speak, into his moon as a place to run my adventures. And at the time, we were pretty tight as far as being, good friends and all of that. So the idea of me running stories that were part of his world was kind of appealing to him. And so we came up with a absolutely ridiculous figure of 1 million gold pieces. And so diligently over the next 3 or 4, I'd say it was probably 3 or 4 months. It felt like 3 or 4 years, but I'm pretty sure it was only 3 or 4 months. I was able to accrue enough gold pieces to actually give him a document in game wherein I transferred the money to, I can't remember whether it was a religious organization, a deity or whatever, or if it was just simply some charlatan who just bilked me for the money. But I got him to agree that I could have the game world if I could have that little moon. I don't even remember the guy's name. This was so long ago, I don't even remember. I know it was in San Antonio, Texas, but I have no idea who it was. Anyway, that's how Nycos became the world that I had, because we had agreed that it would be no larger than 3 grid sheets of 3 hex grid sheets, and that was at, I think, 1/8-inch boxes. It was huge, but it was still just those 3 pages. So once I had that portion down, then I started the reverse engineering of a game world, and I took the places and concepts that had been in my first campaign arc and stretched them out, put some extra real estate in between them, added oceans, added deserts, made it a more expansive game system. But at that point, I still wasn't using any homebrew or any internal roleplay system for dealing with religion and the gods and such. So in retro, if you were to look at it in the Nycos, in the Vademecum, which is my core data book for Nycos, you would see that in the Vademecum there's a story of an emissary, which I describe as a halfling, and I never mention his name, but this emissary being the one who negotiates and coordinates and arranges for access to this world. And I imagined into existence the idea that this person, this being, had to create, if you will, whole cloth a reason for magic to work, and thus I instituted the concepts of magicals clear back in this had to be the late 70s, early 80s. We first started talking magicals, because I remember one of the pieces I worked on was fundamentally a stealth mage, and that was a individual whose armor appeared to be heavy armor, but was actually built and attuned to give it modifiers to magic, as would the items that could be merged together back in those days, the disarmed or the unarmored modifiers, things like the ring and cloak, brooch or whatever, the things that could give you a modifier to your armor class without actually giving you armor. And I stealthed those into that first set of armor. Anyways, very strange. But my only point for mentioning that is that the magical theory actually developed before the concept of the religions of Nycos. At the end of the second iteration, my heroes, the players who had achieved the ultimate goals, had reached what is now commonly known as Paragon levels. They had reached over 15th to 18th level in D&D character identification, and one of them had actually become a true bard by the old rules. And so these legendary characters became the avatars of the deities. I still used otherworldly resources, but I began to put them behind, if you will, without realizing I was going to be calling it the veils. I put them behind a firewall of local autarchs, and these autarchs were the player characters from second and third iteration, and that became the process for the development of religions for a long time. Now, Dungeons and Dragons rules gave a lot of modifiers to the specialty classes and almost nothing to the standards. So, for example, a paladin, of course, gets the healing abilities, and he gets to learn to ride a horse for free and is very wealthy and all of this. And the ranger has all of his stealth capabilities and the paramagics that he develops pretty early in his story arc. But the base creatures, base characters, for example, even the priests, the clerics, didn't have this. And so it didn't take long for me to shift the reality from the characters picking gods that meant absolutely nothing, and rolling dice for rituals that didn't have any impact on the story, to shifting to where the archetypes, these autarchs from the previous storylines, became their guides. And at first they were very hands-on, very Greek in their structure as far as being manipulative and argumentative and petty and things like that. Okay, so Travis asked a couple good questions, and I'll answer them both here in a second, Travis. Where I was going with this is that the concept of the gods choosing the players and then messing with them was an extension from that concept of utilizing the sort of Greek model for god involvement. It was almost like the characters had, the previous autarch characters had achieved deity status, but didn't even know what to do with it. So they were just running around with all this ultimate power and not being very useful. But that led much later to the development, indirectly, because of a certain player in my 7th iteration, to cloak them behind the veils. Now there had been the veils were actually instituted under the 6th iteration by Good King Ash and his allies, but they as players weren't around any longer to interact with the cast, so their antics and stories weren't even yet told. So they were the gods were seen as frivolous and not really useful. And so I wanted to find a way to make it so that the power was isolated but separated from the characters, so that you didn't have to know who the players were to appreciate the power level that they represented. So the questions that Travis asked, the first one he asked is, are these the same creatures that are made of pure magic? No, actually, magic hadn't yet evolved its identity. Magic at that point was still just the essence of how spells worked, and there wasn't an engine for it. I described how magic worked so that I could explain for myself, who was kind of a pseudo-scientific mind, how the spells were being triggered and how the effects worked. But I didn't go into the details on the magic becoming sentient. That was actually, the later functions actually developed as the players themselves began to help me define by their own actions what the material, how it functioned. So mechanically, what they meant is that in second iteration there was no agency by magic. It was just simply a magical force. Third iteration, the magical force could be imbued into metals, and so the players began to actually craft tools and weapons and such, and thus created the first dream prism. Once it was created, then we ran into the issues of how sentience formed within magic, and we haven't got into that argument yet, and so we're going to hold off on that. But yes, the question was, do the archetypes, the autarchs, did they represent larger deities? And that's yes. I just simply didn't name them any longer, so that the power was seen as coming from my NPCs, but the real functional rulings, if you will, were coming from gods, demigods, and heroes, and then later from legends and lore. Let's see. Okay, so that's the end of those two questions. So going back to where I was, the concept of therefore cosmology of the world is that it came to exist because Bilbo Baggins bought a planet and then populated it with the creatures and such that he and the adventuring parties that I had working for me in story gathered. So if I wanted, when I first brought over dragons, they were actually captured by player characters and then sold into the system, sold to an undisclosed buyer who was transiting them to Nycos. Then along comes some really cool books that really influenced my storyline, and when I mention them, there's going to be all kinds of light bulbs go on. The first one that struck me was Dragon Riders of Pern. Arguably why can't I remember the dragon's name? It's a white dragon. Anyway, the dragon in that story was the first time I'd seen a dragon with a personality that wasn't rending things and eating its foes and all of that. So this little white dragon had one ability that the others didn't have, and that was the ability to jump. Let me rephrase that. The dragonettes on Pern had the natural ability to basically blink. They'd move from one place to another instantaneously just by will, and it was a natural defense to a periodic event that was known as the strands. And the idea is this strand, this material, would fall out of the heavens as two moons passed each other. And that's when I thought, well, gosh, if we can do it with moons, why can't we do it with the sun? And therefore Nimbus, which I had already determined looked like Jupiter. I mean, from the get-go, I wanted to have it be a memorable and identifiable world. So right from the beginning, I moved Nycos from its orbit around a standard rock iron core planet to around a gas giant. And then from that, the dragons evolved into these creatures that could jump this magnificent distance from the solar body down to the planet's surface. I also was kind of dissatisfied with Dungeons and Dragons' approach to dragons in that there were clearly good dragons and clearly evil dragons, but there really wasn't much in the middle. And so, looking at their structure, it was a no-brainer to go from chromatics with solid plain colors to metallics by way of crystal. And so the crystal dragons became my median alignment ones, the neutrals. And their utilization of Nycos as a planetary breeding ground made a whole lot of sense when you considered that the planet's surface was so, and the Nimbus's atmosphere is so heavy and so oppressive that the dragons are constantly under this monstrous pressure. So only when the little moon gets close enough, which was just on a periodic basis, the dragons could jump. And this also led to the original Primus wings, which were those who rode upon the prism dragons, because I saw the eldest of elvish races, the Primus, which from the roleplay games concept are the Grey Elves, their understanding and recognition of the longevity of time and that things really don't matter in the short term leads them to also be somewhat neutral in their behavior. And so the first writers of the prismatic dragons were the Eldrin. At the time they were still elves and still Grey Elves. They hadn't yet received their own nomenclature. They weren't even Primus yet. And then when AD&D 2nd edition came out, this would have been about 4th iteration. Yeah, the idea of dragon riders kind of lost favor. That was kind of passé. Other players were doing dragon riding in their campaigns, and so the Eldrin switched to using giant birds, and so their names of their divisions became associated not only with the ancient gemstones that they flew under, ruby, chalcedony, etc. The wings actually became associated with the birds. So a chalcedony wing was a falcon, whereas a barrel wing was hawks, and so on. So I used all the raptors, the giant raptors, as the source material for that. Now, going back to the cosmology concept, the Eldrin, as Tolkien did with his creation, you have to have somebody who is the guinea pig, and so I made the Primus Eldrin, back then the Grey Elves, my most ancient of species, and that they actually were living on Nycos when I captured it, if you will. And so there's always been this underlying resentment between the Primus and everyone else because it was their world first. This therefore led characters who were of Eldrin blood to tend to play rather extremes. Either they were absolutely supportive of the Primus position and doing everything they could to continue to foment the idea that the Primus belonged and nobody else did, or they went to the other end of the spectrum and played wood elves who were trying to be conciliatory towards the other races, and particularly humans, which were the only race that didn't exist on Nycos first. Therefore, by the time we get to 4th and 5th iteration, the world is fairly well set. Players actually are aware of the coming chronology, that they literally are building towards the various stages of development of the campaign well in advance, so that the actual conflict, if you will, the actual war of it all, had to be the part that shifted and adapted. And when in the 4th iteration my players did a better job of creating a campaign arc than I did, and I cabbaged onto it wholesale, it kind of set in motion the final piece of what is Nycos, and that is that the players' actions directly influence the way the game plays. And there are certain players in my campaigns that are intimately aware of this and do everything they can to, wow, we're only at half an hour, doing pretty good, getting through this stuff pretty quick. They're aware that they can manipulate, and so it becomes a matter of being cautious in how I present things so that I don't give them the thought or the power, if you will, to actually take the course off of what I kind of have as a hopeful direction. This does lead, of course, in long term to problematics, but that, of course, will be dealt with at a later time, in a different episode, if you will, of this Insider series. But now we've talked about cosmology and how things came to be. I'd like to spend the next half an hour or so going over the various veils, and I'm not going to go into all the details. That material has been created and will be available, but I want to talk a little bit about the very idea of the veils as they exist. And this is going to take me down kind of a rocky road. In 1997, my daughter was killed in a car accident, and she was only 9, and my mother-in-law was driving the car that the accident occurred in, and my mother-in-law fell asleep at the wheel. And the death of my daughter fundamentally broke the universe for me. I mean, in a way that just restarting a D&D campaign can't fix. Your mindset when you're a storyteller is that the story can always be reconfigured. That if a player does something that changes the story, you can always just rebuild it back to the way it was by engineering. And the subsequent loss of my marriage after 24 years, and the changes in my life economically that have occurred over time, they're all related to it. And coming to a realization that the nice, stoic, steady way that I looked at the religion of the world, the real one, the real life, morality, ethics, structure, was too severe and too irrational for me to continue. And I have a lot of friends in the Christian world that look at my situation and shake their heads, because the marriage ending debacle in my case did include infidelity, did include my wife straying and all of that. And many of my good friends would argue that it's okay, that you can get past it and just get back on the horse. But I questioned God pretty heavily. I challenged the ideas, because the very things that I had hoped for, that I had kind of built my life towards, were crushed with that loss. And I don't want to go all the details, and it's not useful for this, but the point is that the very formation of religion, the very structure by which religion exists in the real world, can't exist in the fantasy realm, because in the fantasy realm you can fix it all the time. You can undo the things that have happened. You can rebuild. But I wanted to have something in there that had a constancy to it, and that's why I developed the very concept of the 10 constants, that the 10 functional purposes for existence are at war with each other and combining together for their mutual advancements from time to time, at least, give an opportunity for players to explore their individual morality without running into the same kind of drama that I ran into in real life. So, when you look at the 10 constants, the 9 veils, you can see sort of how, given any one of them, there is an exclusionary process. If you are going for a certain agenda, you have to blot out its opposite. You have to not even see it as a possibility. So, the actual concept of veils to mark them actually was an indirectly caused by a certain player in one of my campaigns who happens to be a miniatures painter by the name of Matt Unger, had drawn a picture of his character who was a priest and who was trying to figure out how to resolve the conflicts in the universe through control. And so Robin of the Red Band wore armor and armament and a surcoat that was very reminiscent of the Crusades, a very large red cross on a white suit of armor, or rather a white tabard with a red cross on it. But when he drew the picture, he didn't do the details of the face. Instead, he hid the face in shadows behind a veil. And that image kind of caught me as like, okay, that would explain how it is that the different deity powers can be localized to the recognizable archetypes and yet not reveal the personality behind them. Hence, Robin of the Red Veils became the first of the Red Veils. Not because he thought of that or that it was his control aspect to try to create the very feel of it, but it gave me a great leg up, if you will, to identifying the groups. Realizing, therefore, that the 10 constants represent idealizations of that which players can pursue, gives each a strong identity and a recognition of the allies and enemies that said group might have. I could actually pull them up. Let's see. No, I'm running out of time here. I've only got another 10 minutes or so to wrap this up. So, what's important to note is that the veils only really apply to the 7th and 8th iteration, and the 7th only tangentially. The players never actually met up with the deities in 7th directly, except for some specific instances. But the clerics were very identifiable in terms of their flavor as they pursued their particular sets of agendas. And if you go backwards through time, there'll be the mention of names that come from Terran, earthly backgrounds, because there have been players actually playing characters from Earth that came to Nycos throughout time. And at this point, I believe there are still 4 copies of the King James Bible someplace on Nycos, brought here during various iterations and protected by different groups for different reasons. And thankfully, none of the adventuring groups have ever pursued the aspects of trying to find out what is real truth, because that would make for some rather dynamic and frightening storytelling. Well, I'm about out of time, and I want to thank you guys for bearing with me when I was telling that dark part of my story. But I just wanted you to get a feel for why Nycos' religions seem a bit frivolous or inconsequential, and that's only because in life the pursuit of purity, of what is right, tends to get muddied simply by trying to find it. Anyway, more on that in a later episode on philosophy or something. This is Jonathan Albin, the Game Market Guru for Nycos Insider. Thank you for watching. Make sure you catch the stream coming up at 6 p.m. tonight. Winds of the West The episode is going to be Rising Tides and Rolling Waves. You can see that on twitch.tv and on YouTube, 6 p.m. Pacific tonight. Thanks and have a great night. Jonathan Albin, the Game Market Guru. See you later.